So what is a woman's role? Gilead is based on this idea of returning to proper roles for men and women. Some sort of ideal of masculinity and femininity that is grounded in the biblical text. And we see some indications of what Gilead seems to think a woman's role is. In fact, the first time it starts to appear is on page 10, when we're introduced to Rita and Cora. And of course, they're talking about Offred's choice to be a handmaid. And they are cooks. They are domestics, called Marthas. And you can even hear in that name Marthas that we are drawing on the biblical text, right? The story of Mary and Martha, where Martha is the one who does the work. Is that a woman's role, domesticity? We have this repeated again on page 45 when Serena Joy's teaching is being talked about. Offred is remembering the before time when Serena was making speeches, the bottom of 45. Her speeches were about the sanctity of the home, about how women should stay home. Serena Joy didn't do this herself, but she made speeches instead. But she presented this failure of hers as a sacrifice she was making for the good of all. Is that a woman's role, domesticity, to stay home? In a lot of cultures, it is. In a lot of parts of our culture, it is. What about motherhood? Gilead also presents motherhood as a woman's primary role. In fact, that's why Gilead is structured the way it is. That's the entire reason for the handmaid system. There's a fertility crisis, and motherhood is what women need to be doing to ensure the survival of the species. And let's face it, they're not wrong, right? Like, if women don't have babies, there isn't a future for humanity. This is why the doctor on page 61 offers to impregnate Offred. Do you remember this scene? It's hard to read it and not remember it because it's so... it makes me queasy. He explains to her that there's no such thing as a sterile man anymore, not officially. It's only the women who are fruitful and women who are barren. That's the law. But he then goes on to make it clear that the real problem is that some of the commanders are actually themselves sterile, and that's why the women aren't getting pregnant. And he's offering himself, his services, to solve the problem. And as he does this, of course, he touches her thigh, pats her gently. The knowledge of his power hangs nevertheless in the air as he pats my thigh, withdraws himself behind the hanging sheet. If the purpose of women is motherhood, the doctor's not exactly out of line. He's trying to help Offred achieve her purpose in her society in the only way that is viable and possible. And of course, if you're thinking about this and you think, what about like artificial insemination? Remember, that's been deemed irreligious. So it's natural insemination. But it certainly seems problematic, especially in the doctor's office. We see this echoed again in the birthday chapter, where all of the handmaids gather to participate in a birth. And if you've watched the TV version, they do a fabulous job of this, having the wives in the one room pretending that they're giving birth, pretending that they're in labor and supporting the wife, while in another room, the actual handmaid who's actually giving birth and actually having contractions and actually in labor is doing it for real. And there's this sense, though, that this is what a woman's role is, to give birth and to raise children. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with being a mom. I have 2 kids. I love my kids. Being a mom has been a fabulous surprise and gift and delight. But what happens when a woman's role is reduced to that? And that becomes what she's about, what her identity is wrapped up in. In such a context, does the doctor's offer make sense? It might. It starts to occur to me that maybe in this book, the real role of women is to be objects of suffering. On page 115, the handmaids are referred to as little whores. They are seen as something necessary but awful, a sort of necessary evil, so that the wives can have their babies. On the page right before that, we see a different way in which women are marked as objects of suffering. Aunt Elizabeth, one of the aunts from the Red Center, explains that there are no drugs, no induced labor, that all of the horrible things that used to happen in childbirth, we don't do any of that anymore. No anesthetics even. And Aunt Elizabeth said it was better for the baby. This is the bottom of 114. But also, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. It's in the Bible, after all. You're supposed to suffer in childbirth. And if that seems ridiculous to you, that was actually an argument made throughout the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century against using anesthesia in labor. For real. I've actually still heard it today in some communities. We see other ways that women are considered to be sort of marked for suffering. Aunt Lydia's conversation about the things that happen to women on page 155. She talks about things, the word that stood in that was when something was too distasteful or filthy or horrible to pass her lips. A successful life for her was one that avoided things, excluded things. Such things do not happen to nice women. Underneath that entire passage is this sense of, if you're the wrong sort of woman, you're definitely marked for suffering. And the only way you can get out of suffering is maybe by being the right sort of woman. But even then in childbirth, you still should suffer. And perhaps this is why on page 125, Offred makes the comment about how pain marks you. She says, all that remains, and she's referring to pain here specifically in the context of the pain of childbirth, but it becomes really resonant for so many other types of pain that these women bear. All that remains of it is a shadow, not in the mind even, in the flesh. Pain marks you, but too deep to see. Are women to be objects of suffering? That seems to be one of the absolute things that comes through in this book, that maybe that's the role of women. But also objects of the male gaze that causes suffering so often. And we see that throughout this book, in the structure of the handmaids, in the memories of the before times, in the way that the commander treats Offred, in the library, in what we'll see as you read on in Jezebel's. So maybe it's not even objects of suffering that's the purpose of women. Maybe the purpose of women is simply to be objects. Do you think that's true? Because that's the world this book presents. That's why it is a lament. That is what is being lamented, right? The situation that women find themselves in. So if it's a right diagnosis, is it a right situation? As you keep reading, one of the things you can consider is, how does this book challenge your own views about women's roles? And how might we all be participating in the same forms of objectification that actually shape Gilead?